Welcome, everyone, to this Democracy Forum event. It is just fantastic to see such a large crowd. Thank you all for being here. My name is Christina Walbrecht. I'm a professor of political science here at Notre Dame, and I have the honor to start us off by introducing the 17th president of the University of Notre Dame, Dr. John Jenkins.
Well, thank you, Christina, and for that introduction. It's great to see this crowd. I'm sorry for you people in the back who have to stand, but it's wonderful to see the interest here for our speaker. As Christina mentioned, tonight's event is part of a broader year-long Notre Dame Forum on the future of democracy. Our aim through these events is to foster respectful and informed dialogue and reflection on the rising threats to democracy at home and abroad, and how democracy can be reinvigorated to meet the challenges of our time. We've all seen how, in recent years, democratic norms and institutions have come under attack in the US and around the world. Ideological extremism has exacerbated polarization, partisan animosity, and social distrust, leaving many doubting the integrity of the electoral process. The University of Notre Dame has a long history of reaching across the aisle. This arises, at least in part, from a Catholic tradition that prioritizes a concern for the common good, which is an ideal that recognizes our social interdependence, the need for collective cooperation, and the truth that we all must contribute to and benefit from our political life in order to flourish. Inspired by this ideal, we hope that through the expertise of our faculty and a commitment to civil discourse, we can contribute to the strengthening of democratic institutions and processes. And we are honored tonight to welcome Steve Levitsky, one of the most prominent political scientists of our time, here with us this evening to discuss the many challenges facing democratic norms today. A Harvard professor and best-selling author, Steve is also an old friend of Notre Dame. Early in his career, Steve was a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, where he worked on his first book, an insightful study of the Peronist Party in Argentina, and he has since collaborated on numerous projects with our faculty members. Steve's work examines political systems across the world to identify emerging patterns that guide the work of scholars and policymakers. His comparative work underscores how the historical experience of other nations offers important lessons for the United States, and his best-selling book, co-authored by Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Dies, has inspired global discussion about how democratic backsliding and the threat about democratic backsliding and the threats it poses to our world. And now his latest book, Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point, examines the challenges facing the U.S. in this crucial moment and charts a path forward to strengthen our democracy. So thank you very much, Steve, for coming back to Notre Dame to share this important work with us. And now I'm going to turn it back to Christina.
So it is my honor to welcome you all to tonight's event. As Father Jenkins said, this is part of the Notre Dame Forum on the Future of Democracy. Since its establishment in 2005 by University President Rev. John Jenkins, C.S.C., each year the Notre Dame Forum invites campus-wide dialogue about issues of importance to the university, to the nation, and to the world. And certainly tonight we're going to talk about one of the most important of those. Our speaker tonight, Stephen Levitsky, is David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, with a particular focus on Latin America. The author or editor of more than a dozen books, Professor Levitsky, as Father Jenkins mentioned, is the author, along with Professor Daniel Ziblatt, of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller, and published in 25 different languages, and I think is familiar to many of the students here tonight. I certainly know it's taught widely in the political science department. His newest book with Professor Sablot is Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point, which is the subject of his presentation tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Levitsky to Notre Dame.
Thanks. Thank you. You hear me okay? Yes. All right. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Father John. Thanks to the Notre Dame Forum. It is a great honor to be here and a real pleasure to be back among many friends. The only thing I remember about being a visiting scholar here back in the late 1990s was the football team was terrible. I'm glad that's gotten better. So that was the last joke. The United States is experiencing what regimes scholars call democratic backsliding. All leading global democracy indices register a decline for the United States since 2016 or 17. Just to take one example, Freedom House has a global freedom index, which scores all countries annually from a low of 0, North Korea, to a high of 100. A decade ago, the United States received a score of 92 out of 100, which put the U.S. roughly on par with the UK, Japan, Canada, Germany. Today, the U.S. score is 83. That's tied with Romania and below Argentina. Now, that may seem shocking to you, but when you have widespread efforts to make it harder to vote, when you have violent threats against election workers and elected officials, and when you have an attempt by an incumbent president to overturn an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina. Now, this wasn't supposed to happen. Political scientists have discovered two seemingly rock-solid facts about democracies. First of all, rich democracies never die. The wealthiest democracies ever to break down, Argentina and Hungary, both had a per capita GDP of about $17,000 in today's dollars. The U.S. is 4 times richer than that. Second, seemingly rock-solid fact about democracies is that old democracies never die. No democracy over the age of 50 is ever broken down. Even if we date the birth of our democracy at 1965, when we achieved full suffrage, U.S. democracy was over 50 when Donald Trump was elected. So we ought to be safe, but we're not. In Tyranny of the Minority, Daniel, and let me help you guys, it's Ziblot. Daniel and I try to understand why we are not safe. And we argue that the United States is undergoing an unprecedented transition, an historic transition, a transition to a multiracial democracy in which a previously dominant group loses its dominant status. That, we argue, has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. But that's only part of the story. Our Constitution, unfortunately, is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. All right, to begin with, the United States is becoming a truly multiracial democracy. The U.S., as you all know, has become much more diverse and much more racially egalitarian over the last 60 years. The number of Black and Latino members of Congress has more than quadrupled since my bar mitzvah. I'm not that old. From 28 in 1980 to 114 today. The number of Latino members of Congress has increased from 9 to 55. The number of African Americans in Congress has increased from 19 to 60. For the first time in history, the percentage of African Americans in Congress, or the percentage of Congress that is African American, is now equal to the percentage of the overall population that is African American. In 1965, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 out of 9 are white men. Only 6 of 9 are white. Public opinion has also changed dramatically in the last half century. For the first time in the history of the Republic, a majority of Americans now embrace the core principles of multiracial democracy: ethnic diversity and racial equality. Some examples. In 1980, a majority of Americans opposed laws to ban discrimination in home sales. Today, 80% of Americans support laws banning discrimination in home sales. In the 1990s, most Americans consistently opposed affirmative action. Today, more than 60% of Americans tell Gallup they support affirmative action and greater workplace diversity. More than 60% of Americans now consistently agree with the statement that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. And a recent poll, I think from last year, found that more than 60% of Americans think our schools should teach kids about America's history of racism, even if it makes kids uncomfortable. This is a big deal. For the first time in history, America has a multiracial Democratic majority. But our transition to multiracial democracy confronts two major challenges. I want to talk about these today. First, an authoritarian reaction, and second, a constitution that is amplifying that reaction. I want to take each of those points in turn. First of all, most fundamentally, United States democracy is in crisis today because one of our two major parties is no longer committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. Political parties that are committed to democracy, what the great political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats, small d Democrats, loyal Democrats, parties that are committed to democracy must do three things, and this is taken from Linz. They must unambiguously accept the results of elections, win or lose. They must unambiguously reject the use of violence, and they must break completely with anti-democratic extremists. First two are pretty straightforward, so I want to develop the third point, breaking with anti-democratic extremists. Single leaders, as powerful, as demagogic as they may seem, cannot kill a democracy on their own. No single leader can kill a democracy on his or her own. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. These are what Linz called semi-loyal Democrats. Again, small d Democrats, semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats can be hard to identify in a crowd. They talk like regular politicians. The real litmus test, the way to distinguish a semi-loyal Democrat from a committed Democrat is how they respond to the emergence of anti-democratic extremists in their own camp, on their own flank. When anti-democratic forces emerge on their own flank, loyal Democrats do four things. They publicly and unambiguously condemn anti-democratic behavior, even if it's done by their allies. They expel anti-democratic extremists from their ranks. They refuse to, say, nominate them for public office or support their candidacies. They cease all activities, both private and public, with groups that engage in anti-democratic behavior, and crucially, they join forces, or they're willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals from across the political and ideological spectrum to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. This is Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Semi-loyal Democrats do none of these things. Rather than publicly repudiate anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, they downplay that behavior. They justify it through whataboutism or simply remain silent. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists tolerate them, accommodate them, sometimes even nominate them. And crucially, semi-loyalists refuse to work with ideological rivals to defeat anti-democratic extremists, even when democracy is on the line. In other words, they choose their anti-democratic allies over their pro-democratic rivals. They choose their anti-democratic allies over pro-democratic rivals. Now, semi-loyalists may appear relatively benign. These guys aren't actively trying to kill democracy. They're just regular politicians trying to get ahead, trying to, say, become House Speaker, or regain a Senate majority, maybe stave off a primary challenge, avoid the wrath of the base. But history tells us that semi-loyal behavior inevitably strengthens anti-democratic forces. So when mainstream politicians tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremists, it normalizes them. Mainstream media outlets start to interview them like any other politician. Donors who once shunned them decide that it's okay to contribute to their campaigns. Leading consultants and pollsters start to return their phone calls. And politicians who once kept a distance now decide it might be okay to join them. All of that empowers and emboldens anti-democratic forces. A clear lesson from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1930s and in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s is that when mainstream political parties of the center left or the center right start to flirt or cooperate with extremists, democracies get into trouble. Since 2020, the Republican Party has violated all three of these principles of loyal democratic behavior. Not only was Donald Trump the first U.S. president in history to try to overturn an election, but crucially, the bulk of the Republican Party went along with it. A group called the Republican Accountability Project, a group of conservative never-Trumpers, evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress in the aftermath of the 2020 election to see whether they publicly cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. 86% of them cast doubt on the election. This is crucial. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. It's the cardinal rule of democracy. When a major party cannot accept defeat, democracy's in trouble. Republican politicians, or some of them, have also begun to flirt with political violence. They've embraced individuals, for example, who threatened or killed Black Lives Matter protesters. The McCloskeys, remember the McCloskeys? The St. Louis couple that drew their guns on unarmed protesters, were given a prominent speaking role in the Republican convention. Marjorie Taylor Greene nominated Kyle Rittenhouse. Remember Kyle Rittenhouse? Nominated him for a congressional gold medal. And during the 2022 primary season, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican ads in which candidates brandished or fired guns. I can think of no other major political party in any established democracy in which candidates so openly embraced violence. But the most dangerous feature of the contemporary Republican Party is its pervasive semi-loyalty. Republican leaders knew that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and most of them in private were deeply troubled by his effort to overturn the results. But they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection, and nearly all of them say they will back Trump if he's the nominee in 2024, even if he's convicted of trying to overturn an election. It does not have to be this way. Think about what happened recently in Brazil. Brazilians, as most of you know, elected a Trump-like figure, Jair Bolsonaro, in 2018. The US media called him the Trump of the tropics. Bolsonaro governed a lot like Trump. He governed pretty badly. And like Trump, he narrowly lost his re-election bid in 2022. And like Trump, he tried to overturn the results. But his own political allies refused to go along with it. All major right-wing politicians in Brazil publicly recognized the opposition candidate, Lula's victory, on election night. The president of Congress, all the leading governors in the country recognized the results of the election. In other words, the McConnells, the McCarthys, the DeSantises of Brazil, all of them unambiguously accepted the results of the elections on election night. Brazil had a January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023. Protesters stormed the Congress, the Supreme Court building, the presidential palace. But the Brazilian right uniformly condemned the insurrection. Nobody downplayed it, nobody condoned it, nobody defended it. In fact, right-wing politicians in Brazil pushed for a congressional investigation into the events of January 8th. And finally, whereas Republicans plan to back Trump even if he's convicted of trying to overturn an election, the Brazilian courts barred Bolsonaro from running for the next 8 years, and conservative politicians have accepted that. They have not responded by attacking the legitimacy of the judicial system in Brazil. So whereas Trump remains a major contender for the presidency in the United States, Bolsonaro is now an increasingly marginal figure in Brazilian politics. So there was another path. Republican leaders simply didn't pursue it. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that all Republicans are authoritarian. Many, in fact, millions of Republicans across the country are committed to democracy. But a failure to unambiguously accept election results, a flirtation with violence, and support for an openly authoritarian candidate are all clear signs of a political party that is no longer committed or fully committed to democratic rules of the game. So why is this happening? Why would an established political party like the Republicans, a party that's been competing peacefully in elections for more than 150 years, why would an established party turn away from democracy? Again, in democracies, parties have to be able to live with losing. For parties to live with losing, for parties to tolerate losing, they have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When parties or their supporters perceive losing to pose an existential threat, they tend to radicalize. They tend to try to win at any cost. In other words, we argue that it is an outsized fear of losing that leads parties to turn away from democracy. Think about the Southern Democrats after the Civil War. If anyone accuses me of not being bipartisan, I'm going to rag on the Democrats. Reconstruction was this country's first experiment with multiracial democracy. It brought immediate and widespread black enfranchisement. African Americans were an outright majority or a near majority in most southern states, most post-Confederate states. So their enfranchisement terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did black suffrage threaten the Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, it threatened to overturn the entire racial order in the South. And for many Southern whites, that felt like an existential threat. So the Democrats abandoned any pretense of democracy. As one North Carolina Democrat put it, we cannot outnumber the Negroes. And so we must either out-cheat, out-count, or out-shoot them. And that's what they did. The Democrats used a combination of violent terrorism and election fraud to seize power across the South. They then entrenched themselves in power by using poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures to wipe out African American voting rights. Unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the U.S. South. We fear that something similar, or at least parallel, is happening to the Republican Party today. The Republicans are a party of a majority ethnic group, white Christians, whose electoral and social dominance began to be threatened in the early 21st century. And the origins of that dynamic lie in the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1950s and the 1960s. That, the Civil Rights Revolution, was America's second experiment with multiracial democracy. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, the Republicans were very clearly a minority party. They had been since the New Deal. But the Democrats' embrace of civil rights over the course of the 1960s and 70s alienated many of their racially conservative white voters. And that was especially true in the South, where the vast majority of white voters were Democrats. That fact, the alienation of many white racially conservative voters, created a political opportunity for the Republicans. So beginning with Goldwater, continuing with Nixon and with Reagan, the Republicans pretty systematically for about 20 years appealed to white resentments. And that strategy worked pretty well. Southern whites, over the course of 30 or 40 years, went from being overwhelmingly Democrats to being overwhelmingly Republicans. And the Republicans, over the course of the latter part of the 20th century, established themselves quite effectively as the party of self-identified white Christians. They've won the white vote in every presidential election since 1968. Because 80% of Americans self-identified as white and Christian in the 1970s and 80s, the Republicans achieved quite a bit of electoral success with this strategy. They ceased to be a minority party. In fact, the Republicans won every single presidential election between 1968 and 1988, except for the Watergate election of 1976. But the strategy eventually ran into trouble because while the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. That had a couple of implications for the Republicans. First of all, it posed an electoral challenge. A reliance on white Christian votes made it hard, not impossible, but made it harder for the Republicans to win national majorities in the 21st century. In fact, the Republican Party has not won the popular vote since 2004. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote, translated that into a landslide election victory. 32 years later, 2012, Mitt Romney won a whopping 59% of the white vote, still lost. When Republicans realized they were winning the white vote but losing the American vote, they started to panic. And that's when we saw the first, at least in the recent era, state-level efforts to make it harder for people to register and vote. 2011, 12, 13. But the problem went way beyond just losing elections. For a part of the Republican base, the rise of multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat. Because white Christians were not just any group. They were historically a dominant group. They sat atop all of the country's social hierarchies, right? For 2 centuries, every single president, every vice president, every House Speaker, every Senate Majority Leader, every Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, every Federal Reserve Chair, every Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was a white man. All the way through my bar mitzvah, every single governor, every single Fortune 500 CEO, every flippin' Miss America was white. All of that is now ending rapidly, relentlessly, right before our eyes. We see it in the quadrupling in the number of Black and Latino members of Congress since the 1980s. We see it in the growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on our TV screens, in ads and movies. We see it in mounting societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter protests. And we see it in challenges in classrooms, in newsrooms, to historical narratives that downplay or ignore America's racist past. We are witnessing in our lifetimes an unprecedented assault on this country's racial hierarchies. But when your group is on top of the hierarchy, challenges to that hierarchy can feel threatening. Losing one's dominant social status can generate feelings of loss, of resentment. It can feel like an existential threat. Many Trump voters, not all, many Trump voters feel like they're losing their country. They feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has pushed many rank-and-file Republicans toward extremism. In a survey taken 2 years ago, 56% of Republicans agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. Now, the Republicans' radicalization would pose much less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities govern. In just about every Western democracy, there are 20, 25, maybe 30% of voters who sympathize with what we call far-right positions. But in no other established democracy has that 25 or 30% translated into so much political power. Again, Trump and MAGA have never, not for a day, represented a majority of Americans. Surveys show that majorities of Americans, again, embrace the principles of multiracial democracy. America now has a multiracial democratic majority. But that majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. Now, let me be clear. Counter-majoritarian institutions are a mouthful. They are also essential to democracy. Modern democracy requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything can or should be up for grabs in an election. As Justice Robert Jackson famously put it, some domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities. I want to suggest that 2 domains in particular absolutely must be placed beyond the realm or the reach of majorities. The first is civil rights. Civil liberties like the right to vote, free speech, freedom of association, assembly, freedom of conscience must be protected from the whims of the majority. Pretty obvious. A second domain that must be beyond the reach of majorities is the democratic process itself. Elected governments can't be able to use popular or parliamentary majorities to entrench themselves in power. For example, by changing the rules of the game to undermine competition or weaken their opponents. That's the kind of tyranny of the majority that we saw in Chavez's Venezuela, with Orban in Hungary, and with Netanyahu's judicial reform in Israel. So we need to have, every democracy must have mechanisms to protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. So civil liberties and the right to fair competition are essential minority rights. They are rights that require counter-majoritarian institutions. So institutions like the U.S. Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary with some review power, and relatively high barriers to constitutional reform, these are what I would call essential counter-majoritarian institutions. But not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. In fact, some of them subvert democracy. So just as some domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities, other domains, I would argue, must remain within the reach of majorities. And let me just mention two. One of them is elections. Those with more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. No, to my knowledge, no theory of liberal democracy justifies any other outcome. A second domain that ought to remain within the realm of majorities is legislation. Those who win elections should govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to permanently veto legislation that's backed by parliamentary majorities, provided that legislation doesn't violate basic rights. Institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or that prevent parliamentary majorities from governing are not essential to democracy. In fact, they are antithetical to democracy. The U.S., it turns out, has an unusual number of these undemocratic institutions. The Electoral College, which allows losers of the popular vote to win the presidency. A severely malapportioned Senate that provides equal representation to all states regardless of their population. The Senate filibuster, which is not part of the Constitution, but allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by a majority. And of course, a powerful Supreme Court with lifetime tenure for justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations to come. Now, undemocratic counter-majoritarian institutions are often a product of transitional political pacts, pacts in which powerful authoritarian forces demand special protections in exchange for giving up power. We saw this, for example, in post-Pinochet Chile. We saw it with the Polish communists in 1989. We saw it with whites in South Africa. We see it with the military in contemporary Thailand. In all these cases, authoritarian forces demanded extra protection, a sort of leg up in exchange for giving up power. Now, we don't usually think of the United States, of our counter-majoritarian institutions in these ways, right? We usually think of our counter-majoritarian institutions as a product of far-sighted design. We think of it as part of a carefully crafted blueprint for checks and balances. That, I want to suggest, is in large part a myth. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were very smart folks, but they weren't out there trying to design the perfect republic. They were trying to hold the Union together and prevent a descent into civil war or foreign military intervention. And to do that, to prevent a breakup of the Union and a descent into violence, they realized very quickly that they had to compromise. Madison and Hamilton, two of our most brilliant framers, opposed equal state representation in the Senate. But when small states threatened to bolt the Union, they had to compromise. Madison wanted the Congress to select the president, like contemporary parliamentary systems in Europe. And Madison himself, preferred direct presidential elections to the Electoral College. But Madison's Virginia plan, which would have the Congress elect the president, was voted down. And southern slave states rejected direct elections. So the Electoral College ended up being a sort of third best solution after all the other alternatives were voted down. The filibuster was also not part of the framers' vision for checks and balances. Both Hamilton and Madison strongly opposed supermajority rules for regular legislation. Supermajority rules were not included in the Constitution, not for regular legislation. They were not included in the original Senate. The filibuster emerged later thanks to a sort of weird oversight by early 19th century Senate leaders who were cleaning up the chamber's rules. And it wasn't until late in the 20th century that it actually became a supermajority rule on all legislation. So key counter-majoritarian institutions, things like the Senate and the Electoral College, were not a product of far-sighted design. They were a product of transitional pacts. But whereas transitional pacts in Poland, in Chile, and South Africa were temporary, America's counter-majoritarian institutions, for the most part, became permanent features of our political system. And those permanent features, I want to suggest, now threaten our democracy. The concessions made to small states in 1787 built a bias into our political system. It overrepresented sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College favors sparsely populated states. The U.S. Senate heavily favors sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also mildly biased towards sparsely populated states. That rural bias has always been with us. It's always been undemocratic. But it never seriously advantaged one political party over another because for most of this country's history, both major parties had urban and rural wings. So it didn't really have a partisan effect. It's only in the early 21st century that U.S. parties have split markedly along urban-rural lines. Today, as you all know, Democrats are overwhelmingly based in metropolitan centers, while Republicans are overwhelmingly based in more sparsely populated territories, smaller towns. That gives the Republicans, through no fault of their own, a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, which allows them, importantly, to win and hold national power without winning national electoral majorities. Let me just go over some stuff you already know. The Republicans have won the popular vote for president once since 1988. They've controlled the presidency for most of the 21st century. A popular majority was not enough for Joe Biden to win the presidency in 2020. He had to win by 4 points. Had he won by 3 percentage points, Trump would have been reelected. The Senate is even more skewed. In recent years, the Democrats have needed to win the popular vote in the Senate by about 5 points to retain control. So even if the Democrats consistently win 51, 52% of the national vote for the Senate, the Republicans will control the Senate. Senators, as you know, are elected to staggered 6-year terms. So a third of the chamber is up for election every 2 years. That means it takes 3 elections over a 6-year cycle to fully elect or renovate the Senate. The Democratic Party has won the overall popular vote in every 6-year cycle since 2000. And yet the Republicans have controlled the Senate for nearly half that period. The composition of the Supreme Court is also skewed. 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were confirmed by senators representing less than half the U.S. population, and 3 of them, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Coney Barrett, were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the population. If the popular vote determined who won the presidency and who controlled the Senate, the Supreme Court today would likely have a 6-3 liberal majority. So our institutions increasingly allow those who win fewer votes to govern those who win more votes. That is minority rule. But I want to suggest that the problem goes deeper than that. Our institutions are beginning to reinforce authoritarianism in a couple of ways. First of all, importantly, counter-majoritarian institutions reinforce Republican extremism by shielding the party from competitive pressure. Democratic competition is supposed to work kind of like a market. So when products don't sell, firms lose money. And when firms lose money, they face pressure to probably change their CEO and develop a better product. In democracies, parties are supposed to win votes. They're supposed to win elections. When parties repeatedly lose elections, they face pressure to adapt and broaden their appeal. So when the Democrats lost 3 consecutive presidential elections in 1980, 84, 88, they responded by moving to the center and picking Bill Clinton, a moderate, as their presidential candidate. That's what parties are supposed to do when they lose. That process of adaptation is not happening in the Republican Party. Again, the Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. They badly underperformed from all perspectives in 2018, in 2020, in 2022. And yet there has been no real effort to moderate or to rethink strategy. And that's, I think, because our institutions give the Republicans an electoral crutch. They don't have to win national majorities. They can wield a heck of a lot of power with 47, 48% of the vote. So extremism doesn't cost the Republicans today the way it would in a more competitive environment. Despite everything Trump has done, national power remains tantalizingly within reach for the Republican Party. They are very likely to win control of the Senate in 2024. They've got a pretty good chance of winning the presidency. So why moderate? There's also a danger, I think, that our counter-majoritarian institutions will be self-reinforcing, that they'll help to entrench anti-democratic forces. In politics, as you know, power begets power. The Republicans won the presidency and the Senate in 2016 despite losing the popular vote for both of those institutions. Trump and that Senate, that president and that Senate then went on to fill 3 Supreme Court seats, forging a powerful right-wing majority in the court out of electoral minorities. That Supreme Court, in turn, has enabled state-level authoritarianism, upholding, for example, gerrymandering schemes that permit minority rule in several state legislatures. And in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin, gerrymandered state legislatures have launched a range of anti-democratic initiatives, including measures making it harder to vote. I need a little water. Minority rule is a uniquely American problem. In no other established democracy can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities as consistently or as consequentially as in the United States. Why is that the case? Counter-majoritarian institutions used to be really widespread. States in 19th century Europe had all sorts of undemocratic institutions. By comparison, the US was a progressive democratic regime. European countries had monarchic vetoes, they had indirect elections, they had unelected or badly malapportioned legislative chambers, they had filibuster-like mechanisms through which parliamentary minorities could thwart majorities. They had all of those things. But over the last roughly 100, 120 years, other democracies gradually shed their pre-democratic institutions. So Britain weakened its House of Lords, stripping it of veto power. Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, New Zealand got rid of undemocratic upper chambers. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. Britain, Canada, France, and other democracies established cloture rules that allowed simple majorities to end parliamentary debate, thereby eliminating the possibility of a minority filibuster. All other established democracies imposed term limits or retirement age on their Supreme Court justices. And every other presidential democracy on earth, every one of them, got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies around the world have become more democratic over the last century, eliminating 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majorities. Only the United States retained most of its pre-democratic institutions. So today, again, the United States is the world's only presidential democracy with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world, except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows a parliamentary minority to routinely veto legislation that's backed by the majority. The United States is the only established democracy with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. Every other established democracy has either term limits or mandatory retirement age. And finally, among democracies, the U.S. Constitution is the hardest in the world to amend. We need to democratize American democracy. So in the final chapter of our book, we propose 15 reforms that would help to ensure that electoral majorities win power and govern. Those reforms include a constitutional right to vote and automatic voter registration, include abolition of the Electoral College, democratization of the Senate by eliminating the filibuster and giving more populous states greater representation, and establishing term limits for Supreme Court justices. These are not radical reforms. They already exist in most other democracies. Making it easier to vote, abolishing the Electoral College, eliminating the filibuster, and ending lifetime tenure on the court would simply bring us in line with other established democracies. Now, constitutional reform is really difficult in the United States, but it's worth remembering that Americans have a long history of working to make our political system more democratic. Back in 1787, George Washington wrote a letter to his nephew in which he described the new Constitution, written just weeks earlier, as an imperfect document and said that it would be up to future generations to make it better. And generations of Americans did just that. From the Bill of Rights to the expansion of suffrage to the important Reconstruction amendments to the Progressive era reforms to the Civil Rights era, Americans worked to make our system more democratic. But over the last half century, over the course of most of our lifetimes, we have stopped doing that work. We need to get back to that reformist tradition, and we need to put institutional reform back on the public agenda. We need to start discussing it. If we don't, we risk a slide into minority rule. But, and here I will end, none of this stuff's going to happen before 2024. And in the meantime, we face an imminent authoritarian threat. It is now clear, if it wasn't in 2016, that Donald Trump is an autocrat, right? He violated the cardinal rule of democracy when he tried to overturn the 2020 election. And he's been quite clear, if you've been listening to him, about what he will try to do if he's elected in 2024. He says he will purge the public administration and pack it with loyalists. He says he will use the Justice Department to prosecute and jail his critics. And he says he will try to shut down critical media outlets. I cannot, frankly, think of another major candidate in competitive elections anywhere in the world since World War II who's been as openly, nakedly authoritarian as Donald Trump. Hugo Chavez never said anything like this on the campaign trail. Erdogan and Orban never said this stuff. Not even Putin made such openly authoritarian promises. Given the pervasive semi-loyalty within the Republican Party today, Trump constitutes a far greater threat to our democracy today than he did in 2016. It is therefore imperative that we build a broad coalition in defense of democracy, one that is much broader than anything we are contemplating today. That coalition has to include everybody from AOC and Bernie Sanders to Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, George Bush, and conservative religious and business figures. I'd even consider putting Republicans on Democratic Party tickets in 2024. That is not easy to do. Building a broad coalition, and this is important, requires sacrifice. It requires sacrifice. It requires working with people we've opposed our entire lives. It requires setting aside major policy differences, even on issues that we care deeply about, things like Israel, abortion. That's a big ask, but these are not ordinary times. If we behave as if we are in ordinary times, we could lose our democracy. We stand at a crossroads today. America will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century or it will not be a democracy. Both of those roads lie before us, and there is no turning back. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we're going to give Professor Levitsky a moment or two to drink some water and, recover. And then we're going to be delighted to take your questions. There are going to be people coming around with microphones. People want to raise. While people are raising, I'll take my power to ask the first question. So you were talking about institutions. I want to ask you about mass behavior. So one argument would be one of the challenges to democracy right now is incredibly strong mass partisanship. That there was lots of contention over Donald Trump, but once he became the nominee, 90% of Republican identifying voters supported him, and lots of contention over Clinton, but once she was the nominee, 90%. Is that a place that without amending the Constitution, we have some hope?
I think I focus a lot, for better and worse, on political elites. And one of the reasons why 90% of Republicans lined up behind Trump, just like 90% of Democrats lined up behind Clinton, is that the entire party elite lined up behind Trump. So I don't blame American voters. I blame American politicians and political leaders for these outcomes. The key, it's not easy. It requires, again, great political risk and sacrifice. And sometimes it requires losing an election, which might have happened to the Republicans in 2016. But it had Republican leaders stood up and, as Liz Cheney has, and said, this is unacceptable, we will not support this, Trump would have lost in 2016.
All right. Audience member right there.
Hi, Dr. Levitsky. My name is Dana Moss. I'm in sociology here, and thank you so much for this incredible talk. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this talk. I have two questions. One is about the role of the military. Prior to January 6th, there was a statement issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that said if President Trump were to issue some sort of edict to use the military against peaceful protesters, that they would absolutely not obey that from their commander-in-chief. And it seems that the more authoritarian our politics get, the larger the role of the military may come. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. And also our very unique gun culture playing such a big role in campaigning. If you'd like to or could elaborate on the role of being the most heavily armed nation on earth and the threats to our democracy, that seems to me to be incredibly portending of a problem. So if you could say more. Thank you so much.
You hear me okay? So those are great questions. I'm not sure I have great answers, or even mediocre answers. But so the military is a real asset for U.S. democracy. I mean, I should be clear. U.S. democracy survived the first Trump presidency, and that is no small achievement. Extremely important. One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why U.S. democracy survives is we have a number of very strong institutions. One of them is the institution of civilian control over the military. And I think, and we have a very, very professionalized military that's committed to the Constitution. Now, but it's also committed to obeying orders of civilian presidents. So this is a problem that has occurred in other democracies in the world. When an elected civilian president who has authority over the military, constitutional authority of the military, orders the military to do undemocratic things, it puts the military in a very, very difficult bind. And military leaders, as you pointed out, worried a lot about that in 2020. And with Trump saying that one of the first things he plans to do is use the Insurrection Act against protesters, I'm sure they're worried about it now. I think it is a very, very big advantage. So what Trump tried to do in 2020, 2021 is very recognizable to a scholar of Latin America like me. It was an attempted presidential coup, an autogolpe. But somebody didn't tell Trump this, but you can't succeed in a presidential autogolpe without cooperation of the armed forces. And so thank God he didn't have that. So the fact that we have a very, very professional military is an asset, and I think will continue to be an asset for a while. Gun culture is, I'm not one of those who thinks that the United States is at a high risk for civil war, for reasons I can get into, but I do think we are at risk for a high level of political instability, of regime instability. I think we're headed, certainly in the worst case, for a period of constitutional crisis, sort of sliding in and out of crisis, that probably will be accompanied by a moderately high level of violence. It's very difficult to predict how much, But it's not unreasonable to imagine if we slide back into crisis that there will be a fair level of street violence. There already was some in 2020, that there could be political assassination attempts and terrorist attacks. And the fact that so many Americans, and particularly radicalized Americans, own guns doesn't help.
Other questions? I'm going to go back there. Yes.
So my name is Jacob Shear, and I'm a senior studying political science here. And my question for you is, I agree with your reforms, but I'm worried that maybe they'll lead to political instability, that if we democratize, it will create resentment in rural areas, in predominantly white areas. So how do we alleviate those fears, on this path towards democratization, not as a result of that actually leading to more political instability and then the fracturing of our country?
It's a great question. I think if I were able to have my way and snap my fingers and impose all of the reforms in Chapter 8 of our book tomorrow, that would be a pretty reasonable risk. Perhaps, fortunately, our political system is really hard to reform, and so the prospect of even minor reforms, like making it easier to register and vote, doesn't take constitutional reform, or eliminating the filibuster, even those things are really difficult, and constitutional amendments are not around the corner. So our goal is to begin a public debate about reforms. We do not anticipate that there'll be a calling of I don't even support the calling of a constitutional convention to impose all these reforms in one swoop. Even in the best of scenarios, a handful of these reforms will happen over the course of your lifetime. So my hope is that that the inevitably gradual nature of the reforms are such that they won't have the kind of alienating impact that you I think correctly foresee.
Other questions? Back here? Go ahead.
My name is Michael Forbes, and I'm with the Inspired Leadership Initiative, a fellow here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also a former member of the United States House of Representatives. Thank you, Professor, because you are spot on. I am terrified that our democracy is slowly ebbing away. We saw what happened, obviously, under Trump and many things that you just referenced. I'm concerned, number one, the Voting Rights Act has been diluted to such an extent that, and the Congress will not deal with, renewing the Voting Rights Act in the proper way. And it's just a further evidence that our democracy is slipping away. President Biden himself said he would not encourage them to do away with the filibuster in the United States Senate. And I really do thank you for what you're saying, because without being alarmist, it is very, very real that this democracy is at stake. And I'm wondering if you could just comment on the idea that, some of the time and treasured initiatives that came out of the Johnson administration, like the Civil Rights Act and like the Voting Rights Act, have been diluted to such an extent that it's emboldening the minority. And I again, you mentioned the the Electoral College, and again, nobody seems to want to take up that fight, unfortunately. And so we are looking at a very serious situation in 2024, if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Just a couple of things really briefly. We tend to think of Electoral College reform as impossible, and certainly it's not likely in the months to come. But we actually came, some of you will remember, very, very close to abolishing the Electoral College in 1969 and 1970. Both parties supported abolition of the Electoral College. President Nixon supported abolition of the Electoral College. The Chamber of Commerce, the American Bar Association, the AFL-CIO all supported abolishing the Electoral College. More than 70% of Americans did. It overwhelmingly passed the House. It had a majority in the Senate, but didn't get to the 2/3 of the Senate needed to push it forward. So it fell prey to the fact that it's really hard to amend our Constitution. So we've been close before. I don't think we're quite as far as we sometimes think. In terms of the voting rights, I mean, I don't think the Civil Rights Act is in the same kind of danger, but U.S. is really a very unique democracy in that governments have always made it kind of hard for Americans to vote. In most democracies in the world, certainly all the democracies that I know, government makes it easy to vote. The government sees it as its job to make it easy for citizens to vote. In some countries, it is mandatory to vote. It's considered a civic duty to vote. In other countries, many other democracies, you automatically become registered to vote when you turn 18. In almost every other democracy on earth, election day is either a Sunday or a holiday, so it's easy to vote. Only in this country, going all the way back to the 18th century, has it always been a struggle to register and vote. And so there have been efforts to pass voting rights legislation to kind of build back after what the Supreme Court struck down of the Voting Rights Act. That legislation fell prey to the filibuster. And there's, as you mentioned, a serious debate in the Democratic Party about the wisdom of eliminating the filibuster. I actually had the good fortune of discussing this with a bunch of Democratic Party senators over Zoom, and a bunch of them pushed back hard and said, dude, we're going to be in the minority in the Senate after 2024. Don't take away our filibuster. We want to be able to block, Trump. And that makes sense. If I were a senator, I would think similarly. But from a Democratic standpoint, small d, Democratic standpoint, majorities have to prevail in the legislature. And in the long run, we are a much healthier democracy if we eliminate supermajority rules for regular legislation. And that may be, don't be shocked. Don't be shocked, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, if the Republicans win the presidency and the Senate, if they themselves don't come under huge pressure to eliminate the filibuster. I think they probably will do it, and I actually will support it if they do it.
Got time for a couple more here? Yeah, you're looking back. I picked you. I'm not being mean on purpose to this side. Okay, I'm seeing some.
Hello, my name's Ryan, and I'm a senior here studying political science. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. But I had a question. What should a loyal Democrat do in the scenario where an authoritarian populist candidate wins an election?
Join the opposition. And that I don't say that lightly, right? Populists are often, they're sometimes ideologically or politically ambiguous. They're sometimes very popular, and sometimes generate an awful lot of enthusiasm among your base. So it's not always easy, especially in the early stages of the election of a populist, to be in opposition. But if you elect to the presidency a figure who is not committed to democratic rules of the game, any loyal Democrat, any liberal Democrat should be in opposition.
Thank you.
All right, over here, I'm looking at students far back. And I'm also not calling only on male students on purpose. If anybody knows me, give me some girls' hands and I will. Women's hands.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this fascinating talk. My name is Boton Csánta, and I'm from Hungary. And you mentioned several times in your talk Hungary as a bad example. And to be honest, I mostly agree with you. But my question is, as a Hungarian, as a citizen, what are your suggestions to make the Hungarian political system more democratic again at this very exact moment? I mean, not theoretically, but what can we do now? Because the opposite parties seems to be weak, and now the Hungarian, so the governing party has the majority, and they can change the rules, just like you said in your presentations, so they can alter the constitutional law, and they did it several times, and I'm not sure what to do with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I don't have, if I had the answer, I'd have a prominent position somewhere. I don't know. Hungary is a case where it is too easy to change the constitution. It takes, again, I mentioned that it should be hard to change the constitution. I think it's too hard to amend the U.S. Constitution, but Hungary is at the other extreme. It takes 2/3 of one parliamentary chamber to amend the constitution. Plus, Hungary has a partially plurality electoral system, which allows for manufactured supermajorities. So Fidesz won a supermajority in the parliament despite not winning 67% of the vote. It won 50-something% of the vote and yet won 2/3 of parliament, which is a very, very dangerous situation, which is what created the trouble that we're in now, because Orban very quickly reformed the constitution and tilted the playing field. So none of that answers your question or solves your problem, but Hungary is clearly a case where it was too easy to reform the constitution. It was too majoritarian, sort of the opposite problem of the United States. Look, Hungary is, I would look to Poland. I mean, Hungary is not, I mean, Orban has been a master in the sense that he has built an authoritarian regime without locking anybody up, without shedding any blood, without stealing any votes, right? He, in many respects, has been less egregiously authoritarian than Trump. He never denied the results of an election. He never tried to overturn an election. And so the legal process remains largely intact. The problem, as you noted, is the Hungarian opposition is very, very weak. And sometimes you just got to keep playing the game and keep working in opposition, which is what the Polish opposition did and eventually won. The playing field is not level in Hungary, particularly Orban and the ruling party's media advantage is massive. But governing is not easy these days. Governments are not popular these days. Orban can and will lose public support. I cannot tell you whether it'll be next year or in 3 years or in 5 years, but the moment, as long as as you keep playing the democratic game or playing the semi-democratic game, most likely in Hungary, the opportunity will arise.
All right, I'm trying to be biased towards students. Way in the back by the Christmas tree.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Chloe and I'm a freshman poli-sci student. I was just wondering how far that you think we should take pro-majoritarian reforms without risking endangering the rights of racial or religious minorities. Good
question. It's great to see so many political science students. It warms my heart. Wonderful. I am not a fan of excessive majoritarianism. As I pointed out, as we've seen in Hungary, if elected majorities, if temporary majorities have the power to change the rules of the game or to threaten basic individual rights, gone way too far. My argument for majoritarianism is specifically in the U.S. context, which is an excessively counter-majoritarian system, one that is more counter-majoritarian than any other established democracy in the world. So a big dose of majoritarianism in the United States will get us into the mainstream of the rest of the democratic world, which is where I'm suggesting that we go. I am not suggesting eliminating the Bill of Rights, which I think is vitally important. I'm not suggesting weakening the independent power of the judiciary, which is critical to upholding the Bill of Rights. I'm certainly not suggesting rolling back legislation like the Civil Rights Act, which has helped to protect minority rights. So ending the filibuster, I don't think threatens ethnic or religious minorities. I can't imagine how abolishing the Electoral College would threaten ethnic or religious majorities. I can't imagine, I don't see how expanding access to the ballot box would threaten ethnic or religious majorities. You know, New Zealand-style majoritarianism or Canadian-style majoritarianism, I don't think would pose a threat.
All right, I'm sorry to say this is my last question. Yeah, go ahead. You in the white. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Levitsky. My name is Santiago Covarrubias. I'm first year MBA here at Notre Dame. And my question is, if you can share anything about the international landscape and the trends, like not just in the US, but different parts of the world. I'm originally from Mexico. And trying to understand how these trends are affecting not just the US democratic system, but the international democratic system that somehow we are all being affected.
Well, very quickly, thanks for your question. Very quickly, we experienced when I was younger, back in the 1990s, an unprecedented democratic expansion. The 1990s were the most favorable period in the history of the world internationally for democracy, in part because the liberal West, the United States and Western Europe, were for about 15 years the dominant economic, military, and ideological power in the world. And during that period, democracy spread further than ever before and reached countries that had never been democratic, and according to most social science theory, were not expected to be democratic. So democracy really overperformed in the 1990s. The last 2 decades have been a little tougher, in large part because that great international environment has faded. Probably inevitably, Western liberal hegemony of the 1990s has ceased to be. We've become a much more multipolar world. The United States and Europe are not as powerful and prestigious as they were, and obviously China and Russia and other illiberal, anti-liberal forces are much stronger. And so the international environment today is considerably less favorable to democracy than it was 25 years ago. And that's not going to fundamentally change, I don't think. There are events and developments and that matter that can push things in one direction or another. The outcome of the war in Ukraine will matter. But we're heading for a while into a multipolar world in which the U.S. is not going to return to the kind of hegemony that it had. Given that much more difficult international environment in the last 20 years, global democracies fared okay. It's been, in terms of the number of democracies in the world, it's been pretty close to a flat line. There are 5 or 6 fewer democracies today in the world than there were 15 or 20 years ago, which is not terrible. I worry a fair amount about what happens in another Trump term. Clearly, the United States, if it was ever a model for democracy in the world, is ceasing to be that. And this happened before. The U.S. democracy promotion was slowing down before Trump, so I shouldn't assign all of this to Trump. But the U.S., there are a number of cases in the world where the United States just folded its hands, where it could have played a role in defending democracy under Trump. In Honduras, it was arguably a stolen election, and the Trump administration didn't give a damn. So I worry that the global environment for democracy will get worse. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. It's not going to be, there's no going back to 1995, no matter what the outcome of the 2024 election. But if democracy continues to backslide in the United States, or if we fall into a period of crisis and instability, that will, I think, probably accelerate a bit what has been so far a pretty modest decline in global democracy.
Please join me in thanking Professor Levitsky for this important discussion.
Thank you very much.